Wednesday night, Sarah and I went out for dinner. It was a very, very nice dinner at a very, very nice restaurant. It was incredibly expensive, but it was well worth it, and we had good reason because it was our 31st wedding anniversary. And I know many of you are way, way ahead of us, but it was a milestone, and it caused us to think back and reflect back. So I'm reflecting back to our wedding. And I was 35, Sarah was 25. I'd been pastoring a church in Vancouver, the church I grew up in, actually. I'd been pastoring there for a number of years. We were both very, very much involved in the life of that church. And so when it came time to get married and we started putting together our invitation list, we started thinking, who from the congregation can we not invite? And we decided we couldn't. And we decided we had to invite everybody, which was probably 400, 425, 450 people at that point. And so then, of course, we needed to start thinking about our family, because they should probably come too, and our extended family. And Sarah had grown up down in southeastern Washington, and her dad had pastored a church there for almost 2 decades. Deep, deep connections. Well, most of those people really needed to be invited. I had gone to Regent, and Sarah's dad was teaching at Regent, so that whole community, there were many people that we were connected with. I'd been very involved with Young Life and had cooked at this camp up the coast, lots of friends from that. So by the time you start adding it up, you just keep inviting. And we decided that the reception itself, which is the linchpin for expense, was just going to be finger food. We were going to mill around together, and we were going to be at Regent College in the atrium, so that was fine. We could pack lots of people in. So now there were no limits, and anybody we thought of, we invited. So we had a huge wedding, and it was very fun, and it was a huge celebration. Isn't a celebration a celebration? Isn't it great? Isn't it wonderful? So I want to tell you a story this morning. And the story is a story that lets us see Jesus, and it lets us see that Jesus makes all the difference. All the difference. This is a story of a town in Galilee called Cana. I think this is the only time in the whole of the Gospels that this little town is mentioned. And there's a wedding that's going on. So in the story, of course, there would be much music, there'd be procession, there'd be torches, there'd be lamps, there'd be flowers. That's the way they did things back then. The bride would have arrived at the home of the groom, and they would be crowned with garlands. It'd be very, very festive. There would be vows said. There would be the signing of legal documents, making it all fast. And then the wedding feast would start. Typically, a wedding feast at that time would last for at least a day, and usually more than a day, and sometimes would last for up to a week. And there'd be lots of celebration, and lots of food, and lots of wine. Now, at this particular wedding feast, I think they kind of opened the doors too and invited tons of people because Jesus' mother, Mary, was there, and there was probably good reason for that, maybe family connections, who knows. And Jesus himself had been invited, but all of Jesus' disciples also were invited. We know that there were at least 5 of them already, specifically delineated by John in his gospel thus far. There may have been all 12 by this point, we just don't know. But they were invited. They probably had no family connection, except they were connected with Jesus, who was connected with Mary, who got invited to the wedding. And right in the midst of this big celebration, Mary comes up to Jesus. She's got mission in her eyes. She's got intensity and passion. And she comes up, she sidles up to her son, kind of pokes him in the rib, and whispers intensely in his ear, "They have no more wine." Which would have been a huge faux pas. Now, no doubt Mary has had many times before that she has come to Jesus with similar problems. Likely, she has learned that this is a son she can lean on and rely on all along the way. It is most likely that Joseph, her husband, has already died. He's no longer on the scene. It's very probable that Jesus himself has taken over the family business of carpentry, and that Mary has leaned on him and relied on him, as any mother would, and as any widow would. But on this occasion, Jesus does not respond as she expected. And he says, "Dear woman, Why do you involve me? And then he says, my time has not yet come. Now, we're going to come back to that in a moment. You got to say it's a bit of a rebuke. And in fact, the NIV actually softens it a little bit. They insert the word, which was read to us, dear. Dear is not in the text. It's just woman. But Mary perseveres. And she turns to the servants and she says, I love this, do whatever he tells you. And so Jesus then looks over to the side and he points. And the servant's eyes follow where he's pointing. And he says, look over there. Do you see those stone jars, all 6 of them, huge ones? Fill them with water. Now, those jars are big. They're huge. There's 6 of them, and they are stone jars that probably would have held anywhere from about 75 to 115 liters of liquid each. And the reason they're sitting there right by the door is because they would be used at a wedding for ceremonial washing of hands, both before the meal and after the meal, and for all of the utensils and the cups and the bowls and all of that would be used. And good religious Jews would never go about eating without washing their hands in a ceremonial way. And then after dinner, they would do the same. I wonder whether we can actually understand this story a little better, having gone through COVID, right? We got into the public washroom lately somewhere, and there's still the sign on the wall telling you how to wash your hands. 20 seconds worth, sing happy birthday all the way through. Make sure you do it all upright. And we know how to wash hands. They knew how to wash hands ceremonially, before the meal, after the meal. All of the utensils, all of the bowls, all of the cups. And this was especially important at a ceremonial event, like a wedding would be. And so this family would have purchased, or actually probably more likely borrowed, enough of these huge stone jars so there would be enough water for all of the people that were going to be at this celebration. They had 6 huge stone jars. Fill the jars with water, Jesus says. And so you can now see the servants bustling around. They're running back and forth to the well, wherever it was, with buckets of water, and they're topping up the jars, and they're sloshing water as they go. They're so eager. They're so intense. There's this sense of get on with it from Jesus. And so fill the jars, and they fill them to the brim. And then Jesus says, now, draw some of it out and take it to the master of the banquet. And the master of the banquet gets it. I don't know if it was in a ladle or a cup, and he takes it and he smells it, smells the bouquet. He puts it to his lips, he tastes it, and his eyes brighten. He looks up, and this smile comes on his face, smile of appreciation, then he just drinks deeply. And then he beckons the bridegroom to come over. He calls him to his side. He says, my friend, what have you done? What have you done? Most people serve the best wine they've got, as good as they've got. They serve it first. And then when everybody's already drunk quite a bit, they bring out the cheaper stuff. But you, you have saved the best, the exquisite, till now. And then John, the gospel writer, telling us the story, tells us that this was the first of Jesus' signs. What does the sign do? Points you in the direction. This was the first of Jesus' signs revealing his glory, and John tells us his disciples placed faith in him. Now, from this story, there are 4 things that I want to draw out, and there's one word to go with each of the 4 things. So here's the first one. First one is access. And what I want to suggest in the story is that we are being instructed that there is equal access to Jesus, but it's only through the cross. Now, the disciples that were there, Mary that was there, and any of us that are reading the gospel for the first time, we don't know about the cross yet. They didn't know about the cross. But all the way through, John is pointing us towards the cross, and when we get to his account of the cross, and then afterwards, we look back and we go, I get it. And in this story, there are some markers that point us toward the cross. And access comes only through the cross. Now, you would expect that if anyone had access to Jesus, who would have it? Mary, right? She's his mom. If anyone had access, she would have it. And if everyone has access, you would expect that Mary has extra special access. But that is not the case in this story. Did you catch that? When you first hear what Jesus says to his mother and how he addresses her, it seems a little bit abrupt, I would say, a little bit disrespectful almost. Dear woman, why do you involve me? In fact, literally what it says is, what to me and to you, woman? It was a Jewish phrase, and it means something like, what do you and I have in common in this particular situation, woman? Now, can you understand his mom might feel a little bit put off? I remember being in a small group, and we were looking at this passage, and one of the moms in the group said that if her son spoke to her like that, she would smack him. Because it sounds harsh, even disrespectful. Now, it's actually not quite as harsh as it sounds. The word woman isn't actually cold and hard. It actually is a term of endearment. So I would suggest that the NIV in the translation actually gets it exactly right by inserting that word dear in the front to give us the sense of the warmth that's in the word. But it is not quite as dear as the word mother, which is exactly the point. Because as his mom, Mary had an inside track. She was used to just having easy access right there whenever she wanted it. She had learned to lean on him. And simply because of her own position, she was his mom. But Jesus has now entered into his ministry, and it's as if he's putting some distance into the relationship. It's as if he is rebuking her slightly. When it comes to the main thing that Jesus is about, Mary actually does not have an inside track. And so what Jesus says, very kind of cryptically, he says, my time has not yet come. The word is actually hour, and this is a statement that Jesus will make a number of times, or that John, in his account, will editorially put into the text a few times, and we keep on thinking, what's the time? What's the hour? What's that about? And then it's when we get to the brink of the cross that we're told the time has come. And so Jesus in the garden praying to the Father says, Father, the time has come. It's now. It's now. And so the time refers to the cross. This is what Jesus is looking ahead to all the way through. It's what John is calling us to look at all the way through his account. It's what Jesus came to do. And it is the cross that gives access, right? It's only the cross that gives access. And so Mary gets pushback. See, the cross hasn't yet happened, but she presses forward anyway. I love it. Jesus has made his point. It's a little bit enigmatic. He's made the point, and now she comes back. And now she comes, I would suggest, not with special status, but as a believer. One of the commentators puts it this way. He says, when she comes to him as a mother, she gets pushed back. But when she comes to him as a believer, she gets access. And in fact, that's how we come. That's the only way that we can come. And when we do, we have access. Now, there are some sectors of the church that have always believed that Mary had special access and has special access, and that we as believers should piggyback on her access and get in. And this story actually lets us know that's not the case. But some of the rest of us have thought that, whatever access there might be to Jesus, that somehow my own access isn't quite sure. Ever felt like that? Someone else might have access, but I'm not good enough. I'm not spiritual enough. I'm not committed enough. Certainly this week I haven't been. Certainly I haven't spent enough time reading my Bible this week. I haven't had enough victory over the things that bog me down. I haven't prayed enough. I haven't proven myself enough. Have you ever felt that way? But none of that is true either, because the cross is the place, the time that has come. When the cross comes, all of our sin is forgiven. Amen? Isn't that good? And the cross provides the access to Jesus that we could never have otherwise. So come to Jesus on the basis of faith, just like Mary. Come through the cross. Special status? No. Equal status? Yes, absolutely. But only through the cross. Now, this is absolutely foundational. I've got to say that in some ways, I may be reading something into the story at this point, but Jesus makes the comment, the time has not yet come. It refers to the cross. John puts it there for us. The time has not yet come, and the time comes later at the cross. And it is the cross that gives us the access. And it is foundational for us to understand that our own status does not earn us access. Not how devoted we've been, not how good we've been, not how much service we've given to the church, not how many times we've witnessed over the last year, not how much time we've spent in reading the Bible. Nothing gives us access except the cross. His time. His time has come. And that's the thing, the only thing that will do. So access is the first word. The second word that I see in this story has to do with shortfalls. Jesus meets us in our shortfalls. This story is, if it's about anything, it's about coming up short. The groom and his family were putting on this big do. They'd invited so many people. They put on this big event, and wine was an important part of that culture, and they ran out. It would be like Sarah and I and our parents putting on this wedding. We invited all the people, and we were just going to have a mill-around finger food kind of event, but when they got there, if there was just one platter of sandwiches, and that was it. Not only would it be hugely embarrassing, but the people that came would be deeply, deeply offended. Do you not care about us? And at the very least, in this situation, in Cana of Galilee, there would be huge, huge, huge embarrassment. But in that culture, it's also possible that the groom's family would be open actually to a lawsuit from the bride's family, because this was serious business. It was a serious shortfall. And Jesus fills the gap with the best and the most. So I think there's a very personal question that comes out in this story. You ever feel dry? Ever feel like you've run short? Ever feel like you've come up empty, that what you thought you had is completely run out? Maybe what you thought you had really actually wasn't enough in the first place to meet the need of the moment, physically or emotionally or financially or spiritually. The story says, sidle up to Jesus like Mary did. Get connected with Jesus. Come to Jesus. Finances. When we're stretched beyond what we're able, when the bank account is getting kind of thin, lean into Jesus. Abilities. When life and circumstances and responsibility call you to step up and you're just not sure that you've actually got what's needed in the moment, lean into Jesus. Emotional capacity, relational capacity. When you need to give actually beyond what you're able to your kids, to your spouse, to your needy neighbor, to your co-worker, your friends, come to Jesus. So for the last 40 plus years, a regular part of my week usually has been preparing a sermon. And Sarah married into that situation. And as we were going out, she began to see some more of what was behind the scenes. And as we got married, she got to see more of it. And of course, I would spend some time during the week getting ready, but I pulled it all together. It was my practice on Saturday night. And so she would often check in with me how I was doing. And sometimes it would just be so smooth. And sometimes she would check in, and it was just one of those it's not coming together evenings. And I'd start to sweat. And Sarah, over the years, began to love those moments. because she found that often when I told her on the night before that things were just not coming together, that the Lord moved in a special way in the morning beyond my abilities. So she loves it when I'm struggling. And the Apostle Paul got the point. The Lord said to him, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." And Paul then said, "Yes, therefore, I will boast all the more gladly in my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. For when I'm weak, then I'm strong. When I come up empty, he can bring the abundance and the overflow." So where are your gaps at the moment? Where do you fall short? Where do you find that you've opened the cupboard and it's just bare? And how about as a church? Are there any gaps for grace? I know there are. The fact is, in church life, there's always gaps. Isn't that the case? There are always gaps because we're people and we are not perfect and we're fallible. But there are moments where we are more aware of the gaps and the longings. And those are moments where we can lean into the Lord more. It's a good moment. Jesus meets us in our shortfalls. So the first word is access, the second word is shortfalls, and the third word is grace. There is in this story a transformation from law to grace. And I think this is actually the big lesson in the story. Those jars that were sitting by the door were hugely significant. What they represented was an old way of life that was under the law. So they represented the ongoing, unending attempt of religious people to make themselves clean again and again and again. Before the meal, after the meal, all their utensils, they did all that kind of stuff. They washed all the stuff, all in an ongoing attempt to live by the standards of the law of God, to be clean, to be right, to be pure in God's eyes. That's what it was about, and it was never enough. And don't we know what that's like? Don't we? See, the religious folk of Jesus' day were experts at trying to be clean. So the Mishnah is a book that contains all the rules and the regulations and layers of guidelines that had been put in place to try and help the people to live according to the law that God had given. And the Mishnah, in all of its points, has whole sections on washing hands and washing utensils. So the instructions for washing cups and bowls and utensils is the most elaborate part in the whole Mishnah and contains at least, how many chapters do you think? 30. 30 chapters on how to keep everything clean. It's unbelievable. And don't we know what this is like in our own lives, trying to keep ourselves clean by rules? And Jesus takes the water from those jars and transforms it. It's not a mistake. He knew what he was doing. Yes, he was actually responding to a very, very practical need of the moment, but it's more than that. This is one of those acted parables. And what he is communicating is that the winemaker is here. There's transformation. You see, those pots were full of water that you had to keep on using to try and keep yourself in line with God's law. But that water could never be enough, and the water gets transformed into wine of joy. And this is Jesus' first miracle, and it's no mistake. He's here to rescue them and us from the oppression of desperately trying to be good enough on our own, because the winemaker has come. So the Apostle Paul later will make this comment in Romans 6. He says, "You are not under law, but under grace." And what he's doing is he's putting the acted parable into words. And even better yet, 2 Corinthians 5:17, he says, "The old has gone, the new has come." And that's what this story communicates, grace. Grace is here. The winemaker has come. Fourth word, First word is access. The second word is shortfalls. The third word is grace. And the fourth one is abundance, overflowing abundance. So the Old Testament promised that the days of Messiah be ones in which abundance would just overflow again and again. And one of the images that's used in the Old Testament for this abundant overflow is the image of wine. So here's what is said at the end or in the middle of Amos. The reaper will be overtaken by the plowman, and the planter by the one treading grapes. New wine will drip from the mountains and flow from all the hills. They will plant vineyards and drink their wine. It's absolute abundance. So about 10 years ago, this past summer, we went on a family trip. We had been looking forward to it, and we planned it, and we went on a family trip to Europe. One of the places we stopped was London, and one of the places in London that we went with our kids, who were much younger at that point, was the Tower of London. I don't know if you've been there. It's an amazing place to see. And the place that they most liked at the Tower of London was where they kept the treasures. The crown jewels and all the suits of armor and all that. And I can remember our third guy, Trevor, being especially intrigued. When we went to Buckingham Palace and looked at all the artwork, Trevor just blitzed right through. It was, I don't care, and he got to the end and he had to wait for us for about a half hour because he couldn't go back. They wouldn't let him go back. But when we got to the suits of armor and all that stuff, he was just riveted and he was just soaking it all up. And then he came to this case. We all came to it, but he was especially gripped by it. There was this massive punch bowl. It was huge. It was behind the plexiglass. It was made of gold. And it had been designed for King George IV. It commissioned apparently in 1829, but it took them so long to make it that King George IV had actually died before they finished it. It's absolutely ornate. It's completely covered in gold. It weighs apparently almost a quarter of a ton. And that punch bowl would hold 144 bottles of wine. That's gross, right? It's a gross. That's about 108 liters. Now, just to put this story in context, depending on the size of those 6 stone jars by the door, Jesus created not 108 liters of wine, but anywhere from 450 liters to 700 liters of wine. That's abundance. That's abundance. That's the abundance of the kingdom. That's the abundance he brings. The winemaker is here, and he brings the abundance to the whole of life. So Jesus, talking about himself as the good shepherd, says, I've come that they may have life and have it in all its fullness. And Peter, who was there when this water got changed into wine, much later he would write this. He would say, his divine power has given us everything we need for life and godliness through our knowledge of him who has called us by his own glory and goodness. Everything we need for life. That's all the practicalities. It's all the things we need for living. Relationally, emotionally, financially, daily bread, all of those things for life and godliness. How do we live to please God? We're saved in Jesus, and then how do we live to walk with him? Well, everything we need for life and godliness, his divine power has provided. And let me just comment on that word that's in the second line, the word every, which in English is a fairly long word. You need to know that in Greek it's just a teeny little word, which means all. And do you know what all means? It means all. There's nothing left out of all. All is absolutely inclusive. Nothing is accepted. Everything is included. Everything is embraced. And his divine power has given us all we need for life and godliness through our knowledge of him, through being connected with him, through our knowledge of him who has called us by his own glory and goodness. And so I want to say to myself this morning, I want to say to each of you in our personal lives, right where we are, if you've opened the cupboard and you found shortfall, you found you're coming up empty, don't succumb to the meagerness. Don't live, as people have said, by a scarcity mentality, because we are connected with the one who has divine power to give us all we need for life and godliness. And remember the wine. Remember the abundance. And remember that we have access through the cross. And so I'd like to lead us in prayer now. If you just bow your head. And I'd like us to pray, first of all, individually. And I want to invite you, knowing full well that through the cross of Jesus, you have access, you have the right to come and come up right beside him, come right into his presence and put your request before him. And I want to ask you to reflect, and to reflect on the shortages that you are currently feeling personally. Whether it's in needed abilities or strength, and you're feeling you just don't quite have it in you. Or whether there's relationships with dear family members or close friends that have been strained and hurt, and you just don't quite know how to handle it. Finances, time. Where are the gaps? And I invite you to whisper intensely into the ear of Jesus and say, Lord, I just don't have enough. And then I invite you to express the faith of Mary herself when she turns to the servants and says, just do whatever he tells you. Which is to say, Lord, I'll trust you for what you do. I'll wait on you with my need. And then I'd like to invite you as a congregation to turn your attention to this congregation. And what are the gaps? And there may yet be hurts from the past year. Put that before Jesus. We've been praying for 7 young families because we know that for this church to really thrive and be expressive of the whole of life, we would love to see a more diversity of demographics. Put that before Jesus. People to serve and people to come to faith in Jesus. Perhaps the gap of some that used to be here and aren't and have gotten disconnected from church completely, haven't found a new place to settle. Put that before Jesus and whisper in his ear, Lord, we need you. And so, Lord, personally and corporately, we put these things before you. And we have been praying and we continue to pray. And we ask you to be at work. You are the wine maker. You are the giver of abundance. You welcome us into your presence. And our gaps don't threaten you. They are moments of opportunity for your power to be displayed in weakness. And so we give ourselves to you. Please be at work, Lord Jesus, and may it be to your glory. May it be to your glory and increase our faith. We pray it in your name. Amen.